Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, Israel has launched its biggest assault inside Syria since the start of the civil war, targeting much of Iran's military infrastructure there. Syria's military said that 3 people were killed in the attacks. Israeli military positions in the occupied Golan Heights were also shelled overnight. Our international editor, Lindsay Hilsum, joins us from the Golan Heights tonight. Lindsay.
Matt, it's quiet here tonight. I'm about 2 miles from the de facto border with Syria. But in the early hours of this morning, from just after midnight till 4 a.m., it was very noisy here, and some people around here went into bomb shelters. Now, the Israelis say that Iranian forces on the Syrian side fired 20 missiles into Israel, and then they retaliated. It's not clear whether that timeline is correct or, in fact, whether the Israelis fired first. The Israelis have certainly been hitting Iranian military infrastructure inside Syria frequently in the last few months. What the Israeli defense minister said this morning was, well, if it rains over here, we're going to make sure that it pours over there. What they're doing, they say, is taking out whatever Iranian military infrastructure there is on the other side. In fact, the defense minister said they had taken out nearly all of it overnight, which makes one wonder how much of a threat it really was. Because if they could take it all out with what were apparently 28 jets and 70 missiles, according to the Russians, who were warned in advance, one wonders if it was that big a threat. But Prime Minister Netanyahu made it clear. He said that they are not going to allow a build-up of Iranian military infrastructure in Syria. It's called sending a message. Israeli tanks on the border with Syria, a show of force after this morning's missile exchange, in which the Israelis say Iranian Revolutionary Guards fired into Israel from across the border, and they responded in kind.
Iran crossed a red line. Our response was in accordance with that. The military carried out a very extensive strike against Iranian targets in Syria. The Iranian action failed. No rocket landed in Israeli territory.
Residents of Damascus saw and heard an Israeli barrage shortly after midnight. The Syrian government says it intercepted several missiles, which the Israelis deny. On the Israeli side, air raid sirens sounded, and people hid in bomb shelters. Some Iranian missiles reportedly fell short, while others were intercepted by Israel's Iron Dome missile shield. None reached its target.
The biggest question remains, however, why are there Iranian troops 1,600 kilometers away from Iran? I'm standing here on the Israeli border with Syria. Iran is 1,600 kilometers away. Iran has no business being here. The only purpose for them to be here is for hostile purposes to attack Israel.
By daylight, all was calm. The Golan Heights are officially part of Syria, annexed by Israel 5 decades ago. The de facto border stretches away past the white buildings of the United Nations monitoring base. Iranian forces have never attacked Israel directly before. But now the two enemies are within a few miles of each other, and the danger of escalation is acute.
Well, indeed. How acute is it, Lindsay? And were the Israelis, do you think, given the green light by Trump pulling out of the Iran deal?
Well, that's one interpretation, but another could be that the Israelis have been, one might say, provoking the Iranians. Certainly they've been hitting Iranian bases for quite a while now, and the Iranians have not hit back. Maybe the Iranians did not hit back because they wanted to keep the nuclear deal and they didn't want to do anything to destabilize the situation in the region. Now, Iran has said nothing. They haven't said whether they did fire into Israel, although they have said in the past that they will respond to Israeli firing at them. But I think what you can say is this makes everything extremely volatile around here. We know that the Israelis are talking to the Russians, who are of course on the same side as the Iranians in Syria. And the best hope maybe is for Israel and Russia to keep talking to each other and hopefully to cool the temperature down.
Lindsay on the Golan Heights, thanks very much. John.
I've been speaking with David Keyes, Benjamin Netanyahu's spokesperson. I began by asking him if Israel was planning more attacks on Iranian positions in Syria.
Well, it depends what Iran does going forward. It's now tried to move its forces about 1,000 miles west, right to Israel's border. In the early mornings, in the early hours of this morning, it shot dozens of missiles into Israel. We responded in kind. We hope the situation doesn't escalate. But Iran, for some time now, has been undertaking outrageous and aggressive provocations against Israel, lobbing missiles into Israel, supporting terrorist organizations that call for our annihilation, and of course speaking very openly about the fact that they seek nothing less than the destruction of Israel. We will not let that happen, which is precisely why we responded.
This missile attack you say that has occurred on Israel, where were the targets and what damage has been sustained?
Well, they lobbed 20 missiles towards Israel. 4 of them were shot down by our defensive mechanisms, and the rest of them landed actually inside of Syrian territory.
But the response that you've meted out appears to be somewhat larger than the 4 missiles that you shot down and the other ones which landed in Syria anyway.
Well, Iran's aims are a lot bigger than 4 missiles as well. They've sent an awful lot of forces right to our border. They've tried to send advanced weaponry through Syria right to Israel's border, and they consistently call for our annihilation.
I hardly need to tell you that things are very, very delicate in the region, particularly in the aftermath of President Trump's decision to close down the nuclear deal. Was it wise to do this in such a tender moment?
It was exceedingly wise to stop this nuclear deal because it put Iran on a direct path to an arsenal of nuclear weapons. Had Iran kept this deal and nothing had changed about it, in just a few years it would have had enough enriched uranium for 100 nuclear bombs or more. Iran's foreign minister Javad Zarif just a few days ago was on television saying we never wanted to build a bomb. Well, over 100,000 secret files from Iran's atomic archive prove the precise opposite.
Well, why do you then think that the European nations involved in this, and indeed China and Russia, are prepared to continue to respect the treaty with Iran, and you are still not prepared to declare your own arsenal?
Well, the reason that we opposed the nuclear deal with Iran, as I said previously, was very simple. It was because it put Iran on a path to an arsenal of nuclear weapons. That is unacceptable for Israel, that's unacceptable for the region, and it's unacceptable for the world, frankly, given Iran's massive support of terrorism around the world.
Why don't we end on a quick yes or no? Does Israel have a nuclear arsenal?
Israel won't be the first to introduce these weapons into the Middle East, but I think that attention needs to be put very squarely on this terrorist supporting the world's worst state sponsor of terror, a theocracy which brutalizes its own people, from acquiring weapons that they openly say will be used to annihilate the state of Israel. That cannot happen. It should not happen. We won't let that happen.
I can't work out if that's a yes or no.
Well, I'll leave it to your viewers to understand that.
David Keyes, thank you very much indeed for talking with us.
Thank you very much.
Well, I'm joined now via the internet from Tehran by Professor of Political Science at the University of Tehran, Hamed Mousavi. Thanks for coming on the program, Professor. Are you worried that this will escalate, that Iran will retaliate and then Israel will retaliate again, and on it goes?
Well, I mean, we can't really avoid the timing of this whole strike. It happened right after the deal was essentially broken by Donald Trump. And we know that the Israelis have been advocating for the United States to withdraw from the nuclear deal for over a year. Now, the Israelis have actually hit Syrian positions for actually more than 100 times in the past 2 years. Nevertheless, the impact and the aggressiveness of these attacks have escalated in the past 2 to 3 weeks. So yes, it is concerning, I believe.
But do you think that where we might end up with this is all-out war? And is that the way you see it in terms of what America and Israel wants from this?
I mean, Iran has been showing a lot of restraint, both when Israel attacked Iranian positions a few weeks ago that led to actually 7 Iranian deaths, as well as this recent one. Nevertheless, we have to understand that Iran cannot show restraint forever. And there is public opinion mounting in Iran of why are we not responding to these attacks. So it might be a trap to escalate the situation and bring the Middle East to a new conflict, unfortunately.
But you did start, the Iranian side did start firing the missiles overnight onto the Golan Heights. So you started this particular latest spat.
Well, actually, no, the Iranians are saying that it was the Israelis who fired first. And also they are saying that the impact of these Israeli strikes are also being exaggerated by the Israelis. So far, Iranian media has not confirmed even one death. Nevertheless, the strikes are still very significant.
I mean, I have to say, we're all very concerned in this part of the world about this tit for tat. How does it feel to you, to Iranian citizens like yourself, on the ground? I mean, I still remember the pictures of jubilation after the deal was signed in 2015. What's it like now?
There's a lot of disappointment. There's a lot of anger because actually Iran has been abiding by its side of the deal. You know that since the deal was signed, the IAEA has confirmed in 10 reports that Iran has fully obliged with its side of the deal. Nevertheless, the Trump administration, as soon as it came into power, has been trying to torpedo this deal. And right now, essentially, you have Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United States on one side trying to end this deal, and the whole world, including Iran, on the other.
And how do you personally feel, briefly?
I feel concerned and disappointed, but at the same time, I'm not really surprised because Donald Trump hated this deal even before he became president.
Okay. Professor Mousavi, thank you very much indeed.
For decades, no love has been lost between Israel and Iran. For months, they've been skirmishing in Syria, sometimes directly, sometimes via proxies. So it was not for the first time last night that missiles flew. But it does seem this was the first time that Iran itself has sent rockets into Israeli-occupied territory, the Golan Heights. 20 were dispatched, according to Israel, although they had little effect, partly thanks to the Israeli defense system. Israel retaliated, striking Iranian positions in Syria. Iran's taken advantage of the Syrian civil war to build up a military infrastructure there for itself and its ally, Hezbollah. Well, in doing so, it's put more hardware near Israel. With the nuclear deal so fragile, this is arguably a conflict ready to erupt. Here's our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban.
Damascus last night echoed to the sound of anti-aircraft fire as Syrian air defences tried to shoot down Israeli missiles. They've had plenty of practice recently, but they still didn't have much effect.
It is clear that Israel wanted to send a very clear message to Iran. There was a mistake that Israel committed after 2000 when Israel withdrew from Lebanon, and Iran used this in order to build the state within the state to increase and certainly strengthen Hezbollah, and Israel is not going to repeat the same mistake in Syria.
Israel's argument is that an attempted Iranian drone strike in February using a stealthy unmanned aircraft showed that new red lines needed to be drawn. It was shot down, but as this footage demonstrated, packed with explosive. But why should the Iranians accept last night's onslaught? Isn't retaliation inevitable?
Iran regards its presence in Syria as crucial for maintaining its influence in the Levant, and therefore it does not see any option beyond staying in Syria and supporting the current regime of Bashar al-Assad, which means maintaining its forces on the ground. As things stand, it is highly likely that Iran will continue to provoke Israel into responding militarily in Syria. But that doesn't mean that Iran is interested in launching a full-out war on Israel or vice versa.
The Israelis say they bombed more than 50 targets in Syria. How did they manage it with the powerful air defences there? Well, the places they hit were all in the southeast of Syria. If we superimpose 50 or 100-kilometre range arcs for Israeli fighters, you can see that the mission could be accomplished using air-launched missiles and largely without leaving Israeli airspace. As for Russia's powerful air defences in Syria, those appear to have been neutralised by diplomatic means.
I'm sure that on the one hand, Prime Minister Netanyahu made it clear to the Russians that we will not tolerate Iranian strategic ambitions in Syria. And I'm sure that Putin explained to Netanyahu what are the limitations on the Israeli activities from his point of view.
Such is the importance of these understandings that Mr. Netanyahu was in Moscow yesterday, close to President Putin at the annual Victory Day parade. That sent a message to Iran also about the limits of Russia's support in a new age of multipolarity. Iran, Israel, Turkey and Russia are locked in an intense battle in Syria. It's almost 19th century in its ruthlessness and the way that realpolitik is being exploited. And right now, because Iran is on the back foot over the nuclear deal, any large-scale military action by them would be inopportune at this moment. Russia and Israel are taking advantage of that.
Although Iran and Russia are allied in Syria, the alliance is only a pragmatic one, and Russia wants to keep the upper hand in this relationship and actually doesn't mind if Iran every now and then feels pressured, for example, from the Israelis inside Syria. And this has sometimes resulted in Russia feeding intelligence about Iranian presence in Syria to Israel, which has gone ahead and attacked these Iranian targets. And this is all because Russia wants to be stronger than Iran in the Syrian conflict.
Israeli troops occupying the Golan Heights had been braced for retaliation. But it may not come soon. Even so, Iranian leaders have promised to avenge previous strikes, so the lull may be temporary.
Mark Urban. Well, I'm joined by Mark Regev, the Israeli ambassador to the UK, and former spokesperson to the Prime Minister, the Israeli Prime Minister. And also with me, and I'll start with the journalist and author Azadeh Moaveni. Very good evening to you. Azadeh, why does Iran lob 20 rockets at Israeli-occupied territory? I mean, why do they do it? What are they trying to prove?
Well, partly we have to look at it in the context of the last several weeks and months. I mean, Israel has also been striking at Iranian positions in Syria. Iran has resisted, up until now, being goaded to do much more, but is responding in kind to Israeli positions in what we should remember is occupied Syrian territory. I think, however, there was a lot of talk at the beginning in that segment about, how this conflict will unfold and Iran feeling the need to maintain its forces in Syria. I think Iran feels it's very much mission accomplished. I mean, it's secured and helped the regime of Bashar al-Assad stand up against these Saudi...
It looks like Assad has won, which is what they wanted. And then I come back to why you just lob 20 rockets at something is currently occupied by Israel. I mean, it obviously wasn't going to take the Golan Heights back for Syria. It wasn't really defeating Israel in any particular way. It was just a hostile gesture of an immature kind, wasn't it?
Well, I mean, I think the Iranian government is going to be very pragmatic about this. I think they will be very happy, feeling that they've, secured the central government of Syria against
that wasn't helped by missiles being lobbed. I mean, look, tonight, President Rouhani said to Angela Merkel, we don't want any new tensions. It's just a really funny way of showing that at a time when the Europeans are trying to hold the deal together, the nuclear deal, by lobbing some rockets over. It's completely incomprehensible.
Well, no, indeed, and I think Iran may indeed decide that it's, suitable, that it doesn't want to pay that cost, that political cost, and will pull out its few hundred or thousand revolutionary guards that it has in Syria and return to status quo ante. Iran's influence in Syria will be undiminished by pulling out its forces.
Do you think so? Because it feels as though they've been building an infrastructure, as indeed quite a few countries have, but involving themselves in Syria in quite a deep way. And I suppose a question there, and this will be relevant, I'm sure, to what the ambassador says, is that defensive for Iran, or is that just pure interference in a country that is in the most ghastly turmoil at the moment?
Well, I think that Iran feels itself to be ultimately in a defensive position. It has signed on to this nuclear accord. It has abided by its terms. It's seen the United States decide to violate it and come out. You know, the stated sort of problems with Iran that I'm sure the ambassador will talk about and that, you know, President Trump has talked about is Iran's regional behavior. But if the regional behavior is the problem, then pulling out of this nuclear accord
but just the last point.
Yes.
I mean, building infrastructure in Syria, can Iran really claim this is defensive, this is helping Iran? I mean, Syria is, you know, a country away from Iran,
Evan,
isn't
I will tell you, I think that Iran feels like it would behave and engage differently in the region if it did not have to resort to proxies and these types of influence, if it were integrated into a kind of regional security architecture, if it wasn't trying to be economically strangulated by sanctions and was allowed to normalize its ties with the world.
Okay. Let me put some of this to Ambassador Mark Regev. Ambassador, do you recognise, I know you recognise Israel has defensive concerns. They lob rockets at you, you have to defend yourself. And you're going to say that probably 3 times in the next 3 minutes. Do you recognise Iran has defensive concerns?
That's the whole question. I think Syria is about 1,000 miles from Iranian territory. And so what are they actually doing in Syria? Well, 2 things. One, that they've propped up this very brutal and murderous regime of Mr. Assad, supporting his use of chemical weapons. And so they've got a very black record there that the whole international community should be worried about. At the same time, of course, they're trying to build up a military base to attack us from. And we take that very seriously.
Let me just put to you, because the Iranians have a lot to be paranoid about, don't they? Let's be honest. There was a hostile change of regime in 1953. The CIA have admitted they were responsible for inspiring an overthrow of a government. They were invaded by Iraq. The West didn't make a big fuss when chemical weapons were used against Iran. Saudi Arabia spends something like 4 or 5 times more on defense than Iran. You have nuclear weapons. Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. I mean, you can see that Iran might actually, if you could just put your mind into where they are, you could see they may feel, rather as Israel does, that this is actually a rather unfriendly environment they're operating in.
Listen, without dealing with all the premises of your question, I would say the following. We've got nothing against Iran. There was a time when Israel and Iran had a very, very good relationship, not so long ago. I actually visited Iran when we used to have El Al, the Israeli national carrier, used to fly to Tehran. The trouble is the regime. You have a regime in Iran which is very ideological, headed by the aptly called supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, and they are stuck in a very extreme model of the original Islamic revolution of 1979. And unfortunately, they say, don't believe me, they say that that revolution needs to be exported. They say my country should be destroyed. They say that ghastly acts of terrorism are legitimate.
Your defence is never going to rely on whether them saying or not saying they're going to destroy you, because his words is never going to defend Israel. What will defend Israel is having a very strong, technically capable defence. Is it fair on the people of Syria for Israel to get dragged into that conflict and to be throwing missiles into Syria? You know, I know you'll say you're throwing them at Iranian posts in Syria, but this is a nightmare, is it not, for the people of Syria, as bad as anything you could envisage happening plausibly to the people of Israel?
Look, it's terrible. And the terrible civil war has been going on for too long. And Israel has not been a party to that civil war.
No, but you're another of the countries that's interfering in Syria.
Look, we have not been involved in the civil war in a military way whatsoever. But now that could change. Well, and I want to explain why. That if the Assad regime allows the Iranians to build inside Syria a formidable military machine to attack us, obviously we can't sit back as bystanders.
And if they say it isn't to attack you, is that tolerable?
What's it there for? What do the Iranians say?
Sorry, is Syria not going to be allowed to invite at its own volition Iranian involvement in Syria?
I think the opposite is true. The Iranians say, Mr. Assad, you're only there because we fought and died, and we paid the price, and now it's payback time.
And so you have the right to bomb Syria because the Syrian government has invited the Iranians in.
If Iran builds a military presence in Syria, and that is offensive and aimed against us,
well,
we have
they
the
will
right...
deny that. They'll deny that it's offensive.
They can deny it until tomorrow, but guess what?
Even if, whether it is or not, you're not going to let it happen, is your point.
What is interesting and your viewers need to know is on this issue, the Arab states and Israel are one.
I'm not here to talk for the Arab states.
No, but it's important to say this, that the whole region is concerned about Iranian aggression. And I would say to British audiences, you know, they're not used to hearing that Arabs and Israelis agree on a lot. When Arabs and Israelis agree, it's worth paying attention.
Can I ask you one other question? Is it correct that Russia has given Israel intelligence about Iranian positions in Syria?
Look, as your reporter said, Mr. Netanyahu was in Russia earlier this week. We're looking for a diplomatic solution whereby the Iranian military presence in Syria ends peacefully. That's the best outcome. That's what we'd like to see.
Mark Regev, Azadeh, sorry, can't get back to you. We're out of time. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.